start telling you about what I'm going to talk about. Essentially, it all started in the USA, or at least that's the myth. America had been enjoying a bull market in the purchase of shares since the early 1920s. For example, from 282 million shares that changed hands on Wall Street in 1924, the figure had swollen over 6 times by 1929 to 1,824 million shares changing hands. So share ownership and dabbling in the stock market have become a matter of popular concern, with between 1/4 and 1/3 of American citizens having some connection, either having shares themselves or a family, with the stock market by the beginning of 1929. But in September 1929, the US economy began to contract. It's not certain what caused the panic, but on the 21st of October, the stock market ticker tape could not keep pace with the news of share price falls, and it never caught up. Suddenly, speculators became aware that they could lose their homes as well as their savings, and that panic intensified the fall. By Thursday, no one was buying shares, and by the end of the day, 11 well-known speculators had sadly committed suicide. The fabled Black Tuesday occurred the following week, when sound stocks were the first time sold in order to raise liquid capital. And this spectacular end to the fat years in the American economy had profound and long-lasting consequences for the world economy and for domestic politics in Europe. And so here we are. That's what I've been talking about. It's the Wall Street crash of October 1929. You can see at the top of that slide there that the Daily Mail headline, and a lot just below that, a cartoon by David Lowe called "The Morning After." David Lowe, famous cartoonist from the Evening Standard. And this is one of his more famous cartoons, "The Morning After." The speculator there in bed, waking up with the most tremendous hangover, with his room wrecked and a series of imaginary financial pink rats dancing on the end of his bedstead. So obviously this made kind of global news. The biggest problem was that the US, despite being politically and diplomatically isolated from Europe after 1920, nonetheless followed a path of economic intervention, especially after 1924 with the Dawes Plan. It provided loans and credit to Europe on a scale which was almost comparable to that of the Marshall Plan era, the post-1945 Marshall Plan era. And when the stock market crashed, that cheap credit was withdrawn, and the Americans began to call in the loans that they'd been giving to Europe. Likewise, they started to erect tariffs on the entry of goods to their markets. In fact, actually, they'd had tariffs on entry to their market for, throughout the 1920s, but they were raised in consequence of the Wall Street crash. The overproduction of primary and arable products which was a common feature of the 1920s boom, led to a slump in world prices. In other words, you had a glut of supply. And those products, particularly American products, but not just American products, were dumped widely on those countries, particularly Britain, which persisted with free trade. In other words, there were no barriers to entry to the British domestic market, and so they were able to be undercut by those people, those suppliers who had the glut of produce that they needed to get rid of. So that's the broad outline of what happened at the end of 1929. But then it becomes more complicated because, of course, although the crash did affect Britain, it's much more complex than that, because its principal effect economically was to confirm already existing trends in the economy, which indeed had been apparent since the end of the Victorian period. And likewise, it had a political effect, but not the dramatic one that was unleashed in parts of continental Europe. And you see that with, in particular, things like the rise of Nazism in Germany, and also the kind of tensions between extreme right-wing movements elsewhere in Europe and relatively liberal policies at the centre. In fact, the British state showed itself to be remarkably resilient in the face of the quote-unquote economic blizzard. Finally, the term appears. And it was christened that by the Prime Minister at the time, Ramsay MacDonald. So what I'm now going to look at examines both the economics of that and also the politics of that, although they are kind of bound up together. And you might be surprised that actually the chronology here is not going to go very much past 1931. We're used to thinking of the 1930s as the period of the slump, but the reality is that when we're looking at the Depression, its antecedents were available, well, not available, but were already present long before the Wall Street crash. And what happens in the 1930s is really just an exaggeration, a confirmation of those trends that have already been set up. So part of the answer, in fact, lies in the way in which the economy of Britain developed prior to the 20th century, and the way in which the state sometimes led, but more often simply adapted to the changes. So we need to go back to understand this and the way in which the Great Depression impacts on Britain, believe it or not, to the 1870s. And most economic historians are agreed that the so-called Great Depression of the 1870s and 80s in Britain marks the beginning of long-term relative British economic decline, even if it's not necessarily acknowledged as such by those around at the time. We must remember that Britain was the first country to industrialize, and that was based largely on coal, iron, cotton, steam power, free trade, and for the most part on a policy of non-intervention in the market by successive 19th century governments, whether they were liberal governments or conservative ones. And when I say non-intervention in the market, that doesn't mean that the governments don't intervene in other ways or on an ad hoc basis. Then they certainly intervene to try and alleviate some of the consequences of the Depression. But what they don't do is to interfere on the whole with the operation of trade and industry. Added to that, the export trade, and that had played an enormous part in providing the investment capital which allowed for that first wave of industrialization, the first expansion of British industry, really at the end of the 18th century, but more so at the beginning of the 19th. And that began to face barriers to trade from newly industrializing countries like Germany. So I've already spoken about American tariffs, but there are various tariff barriers and quota barriers and various other legal restrictions on where Britain can put her products, if you like. Moreover, other states are beginning to catch up Britain in terms of capital deployment and technical expertise. And that's partly because Britain exhibited a bias in its export industries towards machinery and also towards what you might broadly call technical or entrepreneurial skills. So, for example, it was by no means unknown for a firm with its engineers to temporarily export themselves and an entire workforce to other countries in order to undertake a complete construction project. That happens in, for example, Imperial Russia. There's also the question of Britain's natural weakness in raw materials in comparison to particularly America. And so there is, to some extent, an inevitability about her declining relative share of world trade. But perhaps most importantly, British capital, and by which I mean essentially machinery, tools, and such like, simply wasn't replaced quickly enough as new techniques development. Whether that's for reasons of cost or conservatism or absence of technical skills, quite a varied sort of bundle of reasons around that. But the fact is that capital in Britain in the last decades of the Victorian period, so long before 1929, is already beginning to fall into obsolescence on the whole. And you can see some of the reactions to that, or one of the reactions to that, from this leader column in the Daily Mail in 1901. And it complains about the very things that I was talking about on the previous slide here. In particular, it makes quite unflattering comparison between Britain and America. British railways are fast falling behind the railways of continental Europe. Meanwhile, American lines have yielded magnificent profits to the investor, and this with higher speed, cheaper rates, and many other advantages. We see contract after contract in the open market captured by Americans. It gives an example of a Ugandan railway project there, whereas the British tender to undertake this project is kind of woefully inadequate in various ways, suggests the Mail. And the two reasons that the Mail suggests are the most important ones, the principal ones, for the Britain's failure to keep up in this area are, first of all, because the Americans have tariffs, and their tariffs secure the home market, and it also enables foreign countries, as I pointed out earlier on, to be used as a dumping ground for American surplus productions. So that's not new. That's not new in the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s. This is something that is being complained about a good 30 or 40 years beforehand. And the second thing that the Mail believes Americans have the edge over Brits is that Americans have great alertness of mind. They have the insight to scrap their machinery when it goes out of date and to use every labor-saving contrivance. So I give you that. Now that's you might think, well, that's just the Mail, having one of its periodic rants. But actually, this is very common, and you see this complaint advanced by politicians, by journalists, by commentators, by trade unions, and so forth. And that's before the First World War. So there's a sense in certain parts of British society, perhaps throughout British society, in fact, that Britain is in some way or other falling behind. And the reasons why it's falling behind are because other countries are kind of smarter in terms of updating their practices, and also because they are protected, and I'll be using that term protection quite a lot in the slides that come up, are protected by tariff barriers, which are kind of shielding their nascent industries, their embryonic industries. So what you see there, or at least on the slide prior to the Daily Mail slide, is essentially a broad outline of the relatively uncontentious reasons for the start of Britain's relative economic decline. There are, in fact, more contentious concepts which some commentators have used. So labour immobility, poor management, unionisation, competition that's skewed towards quality, rather than the development of different marketing strategies to fit different markets, no technical education, a failure to embrace new industries at the beginning of the 19th century, things like plastics, chemicals, motor cars, and so forth, and even a natural anti-capitalist bias that is buried deep in British culture. Those things that I've just listed there are more contentious, and historians indeed are still arguing about those. But regardless of of which of those reasons is the most convincing, the reality is that British economic performance was perhaps not as one might expect, given its Victorian heyday at the start of the First World War. And that economic relative decline was worsened by the First World War. It would be wrong to say that the war changed fundamentally the course of British economic history, but it probably accelerated the pace of decline. The war's clearest legacy was the impact that it had on investment and the export trade. And the expansion of the state sector, plus the demands of a war economy, saddled key industries with significant problems of underinvestment. More than any other major country, Britain's position in the world economy on the eve of World War I was determined by her global nature. Britain was the world's leading capital exporter. She accounted for 27% of the whole world's manufactured exports and had a much higher share of trade in GDP, in other words, trade's contribution to gross domestic product, at 54% than any other leading economy, including Germany, which is at 40%, and indeed the United States as well. Only 10% of its annual economic production is vested in or emerges from trade in the US. So Britain is kind of uniquely vulnerable in that respect. What happens is, in the aftermath of the First World War, first of all, there are problems caused by demobilization. That's in respect of reintegrating military personnel into the workforce, and also the reconversion of industries that had been temporarily given over to the demands of the war. They had to be converted back into peacetime production. There was also a major social effect with the kind of almost like forcible removal of many women from the workforce. And although staple industries were not hit directly by the war in terms of, they weren't, unlike in France and Belgium, for example, where they are, they literally suffer damage directly from the fighting. Nonetheless, capital investment in staple industries was at a particularly low position, particularly in coal and the railway industries. And there was also no new housing stock built during the First World War, and no significant new housing stock at least. Likewise, debt had increased, so that simply the interest on national debt was running at £326 million per annum by 1919. And taxes had to remain high in order to finance that interest on the debt. Now, I'll give you the example there that national debt was £7.8 billion at the end of the war. That's 1.3 times gross domestic product, and that's compared with just the very small figure, relatively small figure of 0.6 billion pounds in the full year before the only full year before the outbreak of the First World War. So I use 1913 figures from time to time in this, in what follows, not 1914 ones. And that was only a quarter of GDP. And that causes considerable problems, not just economically in terms of finding the money in order to pay off interest, but also it causes major knock-on political effects, which I'll come to in a slide or two time. I've already indicated that Britain lost substantial markets overseas as well. There was 35% less exports by volume in 1919 compared with 1914. Actually, my apologies. That should be 1913. That date there. That's something that's crept in, and I hadn't noticed that. And this depressed global demand for British products led to persistently high levels of unemployment in what had been staple export industries in the 19th century. I'll give you an idea of the actual destruction of human and physical capital which was attendant on the war. So Britain lost something in the region of 3.6% of her human capital. It seems kind of cold to be referring to the deaths and injuries of people, casualties of the fighting in that way. And of course, that's the only way in which economic historians can measure this kind of thing. So 3.6% of her human capital, about 10% of her domestic assets, and a quite staggering 24% of her overseas assets. Now, that's rather better in some ways than some other countries. So, in contrast to France, for example, she loses 7.2% of her human capital and almost 60% of her domestic assets. But that's largely because a lot of the war on the Western Front is fought on French soil. And indeed, the But the British actually do worse than either of the Central Powers, surprisingly enough, on whose soil the war was not fought on the whole, so Austria and Germany. So Britain is in a fairly parlous state. It's not quite as bad as it could be, but it's in a fairly parlous state in terms of the assets that it has lost. And so in consequence, war arguably accelerates Britain's long-term decline. And unemployment, as we'll see in a second, begins to rise much earlier in Britain than in most continental countries. And it also suffered from, and I've already mentioned this, of course, the dumping of goods on British domestic markets. Britain still having a free trade regime, which allows other goods to be dumped on their markets at a very low price. And Germans' dumping of goods was a way for them to pay their reparation bills. Entirely logical approach from their perspective, but it means a particular problem for British industry. The cartoon on the right-hand side there is from George Strube in the Daily Express, and that's John Bull obviously being besieged by mosquitoes. The mosquito on each of them have the names of different problems written on their wings there. So the mosquito on John Bull's head actually says unemployment. The others, interestingly, are traffic scandal, high prices, housing problem, and trusts. Trusts, in this case, meaning the sort of oligopolistic market behavior, so market fixing, cartelization, and the such like. Okay, I'll just give you an idea of these problems are widely recognized in British society and constantly reported in the press. So just give you that as a slightly more humorous approach to what is otherwise a fairly dreary subject. Oh, I've been talking about unemployment, and I'm going to be going through these figures in a little more depth in a second. But before I do, I'm going to play you something which hopefully will be of interest to you, because this is a music hall song from 1921, and in 1921, in fact, as you can see up here, at the top of the table for Great Britain, you have a substantial proportion of the working population that are already out of work, 14.8% there in 1921. This music hall song is kind of a protest song, and I'm playing it for you now because I think it's well, partly to leaven things a little, but also to show you that that economics is had some kind of real genuine human consequences. The fact that this song was recorded, because recording was expensive, indicates that the sentiments therein were pretty widespread. So the songs don't get recorded unless they have some kind of cachet, or they can be sold, of course, on a gramophone record. Anyway, this is Frank Miller with Stony Broken No Man's Land. It's a bit crackly, but you'll get the idea.
In 1914, 100 years ago it seems, when first the world was awakened from its peaceful dream, the bugle called, I went away. They said I was a man then, but what am I today? I can't get the old job, can't get the new, can't carry on as I used to do. I look around me and daily I see thousands thousands and thousands of fellows, a lot worse off than me. In a Piccadilly, friend, pass me by. I'm absolutely stranded in the Strand. But I confess I was contented more or less when I was sorely broke in no man's land. When the fighting was at its fiercest and everything looked black, this is a promise that cheered us up: you'll get the old job back. When we crossed shell-swept no man's land through poison gas attacks, this promise heard: if you are spared, you'll get the old job back. We were not professional soldiers. Fighting was not our game. We were only peaceful citizens, but we fought just the same. We sacrificed our wives and kids and homes to do our bit. And now the door is closed to us. It seems hard to admit. I can't get the old job, can't get the new, can't carry on as I used to do. I look around me and daily I see thousands and thousands of fellows, a lot worse off than me. In a Piccadilly, friend, pass me by. I'm absolutely stranded in the Strand. But I confess I was contented more or less when I was sorely broke in no man's land.
So, as you can see, that's a jolly ditty. But I use it to indicate that unemployment is not something that suddenly comes in a rush in 1929 in consequence of the slump, but is kind of is endemic, if you like, through the starting at the very beginning of the 19. Okay, so British decline, as we've seen, is kind of cemented and reinforced by the First World War. But the way in which that is felt most keenly by individuals is through, as we've heard on the song, is through unemployment. So there's a short-lived boom in 1919, and then unemployment gets to around 2 million and doesn't actually fall below 1 million again until 1939. The figures that you can see there are not, strictly speaking, all that accurate. They're probably very slightly inflated because of the way in which they have been they were collected. But nonetheless, they'll give you a broad idea here. You've got the you can see though that from 1921 all the way through to 1939, their British unemployment is always in double figures as a percentage of the working population. And it compares pretty badly to the figures for Germany and France. For France, I don't have the percentage figures, which is slightly awkward, which means you can kind of say less about that. But nonetheless, France has a population size which is not dissimilar to that of Britain, so kind of somewhat comparable. Certainly, German unemployment doesn't really climb into double figures in terms of percentage-wise until right at the end of the 1920s. In fact, that is indicative there, that figure there in 1930, that's indicative of the slump hitting Germany. Whereas, although there is a jump in 1930 and in 1931 there for Britain, it's not such a big jump. Likewise, in France, it comes a little later, and that's partly down to the type of economic mix that the French economy has, and also because it's starting from, if you like, a lower base. There's really no great shortage of employment in France for most of the 1920s because it needs to reconstruct its entire economy. Well, that's an exaggeration, but you get the picture. The important thing here, of course, is that it's that high and persistent level of unemployment in Great Britain that I want to highlight. I'll give you a few other figures just to give you an idea, because this is, although you do see that persistent high level of unemployment, the lack of economic activity, and which manifests itself in joblessness, is distributed extremely unevenly through region and industry, and also to some extent over time. So if you look at the unemployment rates in the late 1920s for different regions and different industries, and I'll just give you a couple of example figures here. In London and the southeast, the unemployment rate is around about 6%. In the Midlands, it's around about 9%. When you get to the northeast and northwest of England, and also Scotland, it's topping out towards 14% of the working population, and that's in this period here, where you've got, as you can see, relatively, that's at the bottom end of the range of figures there that you're looking at. Likewise, there's at times the metal industries, the iron and steel industries, have something like 25% unemployment, and that is before the slump hits in 1929, 1930. So this unemployment problem persists, as I say, throughout the interwar years, and it becomes a mainstay of British politics to an extent that it had never been previously. Indeed, it featured metronomically in cabinet agendas throughout the interwar years, not quite to the extent that imperial matters did, largely because Tories prefer to be talking about foreign affairs and diplomacy than they do about economics, but nonetheless to a much greater extent than at any time prior to World War I. And the fact that the government seems unable to solve the unemployment problem leads to lots of accusations of ignorance and neglect against what is largely a Tory government through most of the 1920s, except for, well, technically there's a coalition to begin with, the post-war coalition, and then there's a little blip of minority Labour government in 1924. For most of the 1920s until 1929, it's the Conservative Party in power. And here you see David Lowe again, who's characterising that the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. They're trying to escape this monstrous box labelled the unemployment problem, and that's, as I say, that's the typical criticism that is levelled at the government, that it's running away from the unemployment problem. You'd expect that to some extent from Lowe, because he was quite renowned for being on the left politically. Whether or not that's fair is a different matter. After all, there have been periods of downturn before, and I talked about that first Great Depression. in which the government hadn't intervened to provide employment. By the start of the First World War, it was commonplace to imagine that the state should do something about the effects of joblessness, but the idea that it could or should intervene other than in trade policy was not mainstream. So for most of the 1920s, things like direction of labour, that's literally the physical moving of workers around the country, directing them where to go and where to take jobs, nationalisation, major public works, direct state subsidy, and so on. Those are actually mostly off the table for all three main parties. It just so happens that the Conservatives are in power for most of the 1920s. There are some specific exceptions, like the coal industry, but on the whole, that's the case. The one macroeconomic policy that was mainstream was indeed a trade policy, not an industrial one, and that was potentially the introduction of protection. That is, the raising of tariff barriers and the raising of quotas and various other physical controls to goods entering the market, the British market, that is. And I talked already about the problem of dumping, which predates the First World War, but was certainly intensified by the First World War. But curiously enough, the Conservative Party had tried to gone to the country in the 1923 general election, promising to introduce protection, and then was defeated by a combination of Labour and Liberal parties determined to keep free trade. And that loss of power was kind of a shock to the Conservative Party. When it comes back in 1925, it avoids the issue of protection. And so that's the one weapon that's potentially a mainstream policy that is open to governments in the 1920s. And the Conservative Party, having been burnt once, shies away from it and resorts essentially to lots of kind of ad hoc attempts to solve unemployment. However, what it does do, that government that is restored, the Conservative government that comes back after that small period of a minority Labour government, is make a rod for its own back with the reintroduction of the gold standard. Now, ministers in the Conservative government, largely because of relative ignorance of economics. Well, for example, Winston Churchill once said that it was the one subject that he could never get his head round, economics, which was rather a shame because he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. But they find themselves, the cabinet find themselves being kind of led by the forces of liberal financial orthodoxy. Both the Treasury and the Bank of England, the Bank of England is led by this chap here in the centre, that's Montague Norman, the Bank of England governor, and currency dictator of Europe, apparently. Now, those institutions believe in sound finance and, above all, the reduction of public, that means state, public debt, and we've seen that obviously increase enormously during the war, is the singular goal of economic policy. So in the short term, things like trade balances matter practically nothing to Treasury and the bank, and unemployment probably even less than that. And their solution to the sufferings of the economy was to return to the gold standard. The cartoon on the left-hand side here is from the Daily Mirror. That's Montague Norman as a wizard, and he's talking to poor old Stanley Baldwin again, and essentially telling him why all the things that he might want to do are just going to be far too expensive to do. So you've got the examples of the coal subsidy and the unemployment benefit through the dole and pensions, which are which Norman in this cartoon considers to be, they're all lovely things to have, but they're too costly. By the forces of liberal financial orthodoxy, the gold standard was seen as a return to the 19th century rule to impose discipline on politicians. In other words, it stopped them spending money, and the Treasury hated politicians spending money. When I say the Treasury, I don't mean the politicians who might at one time or another be in control of the Treasury. I mean the institution of the Treasury as a civil service department. After the war, there was a government inquiry called the Cunliffe Committee, and that recommended returning to the gold standard at a pre-war exchange rate of $4.86. Now, this was actually resisted, or at least postponed, by governments, whether they were the coalition government, the Conservative, or the Labour government, and this was postponed until April 1925. And at that point, the Conservatives finally crack, and they re-establish the gold standard. The idea was that this exchange rate would ultimately restore the economy by enabling the public debt ratio to be brought down under 100% of GDP. That's what's really making the Bank of England and the Treasury jittery, is the huge stock of public debt. So they need to introduce the gold standard, this is their belief at least, to pay off the most urgent costs of the war. But that could only be achieved by very severe deflation, which reduces domestic prices and reduces wages very substantially until that exchange rate, the exchange rate chosen, was consistent with what they believed to be the natural level of the economy, in inverted commas. And they believe that actually would produce, in the longer term, a much lower unemployment rate of maybe about 4%, which was considered to be a tolerable figure. So that's the orthodoxy which these two enormous institutions, very powerful institutions, the Treasury and the Bank of England, working in concert, are putting pressure on politicians to re-establish the gold standard for those reasons. This is Will Dyson and the Daily Herald's take on it. The World, they're depicted as a kind of sort of shabby down and out with its placard asking for bread. And surrounding the World, there are the different central bankers, including Montague Norman himself. That's Montague Norman there. Directly behind the globe is Bank of France, and to the left-hand side, that's the USA Federal Reserve. And the brick that's being offered to the world there is the gold brick, is the gold standard. So that's essentially what was being forced on governments. But the problem with returning to the gold standard is that the short-term pain turned out really to be far more severe than they had initially anticipated. And that was especially true in one industry that was absolutely pivotal to Britain's economy, which was coal. Here's another cartoon from this one's from the Daily Express and George Strube again, August 1925. So this is about this is a few months after the reintroduction of the gold standard. You can see there that the figure lying in the road is Old King Cole. Incidentally, this also plays. You may have remember the earlier Stroop cartoon, which mentioned the traffic problem. This is something that kind of bubbles up from time to time throughout the 1920s. The problem with the motor car and how to cope with it and how to stop traffic accidents, which is kind of novel at the time. The motor car in the background here has written on its side the gold standard, and it's the gold standard that seems to have run over the already ailing coal industry even before 1925, and ostensibly coming to the coal industry's rescue here is the stretcher bearers, and the stretcher is the poor old taxpayer. This is the kind of the Express's take on it, which of course is obviously leaning to the right in comparison to some of the other cartoons that we've seen on the preceding slides. Okay, why is coal important? Coal is absolutely central as a power source to almost all domestic industry. So, for example, it required about 4 tons of coal to produce 1 ton of pottery, and about 3 tons to produce 1 ton of steel. During the war, the demands of war production had left the most accessible coal seams dug out, but there hadn't really been any equivalent investment into exploration of deeper seams. That's largely because the government during the First World War took control, not ownership, but control of the mines for war production. But there wasn't any profit generated for the mine owners during the war, that is, and so there wasn't a great deal of investment funds available to them in the immediate post-war aftermath. This shows you just how important coal had been prior to the outbreak of World War I. It produced 288 million tons of coal and exported 73 of those in 1913. But by 1928, output was less than half of that, at 102 million tons, and only 20 million was exported. Its workforce was highly unionized and increasingly militant, especially after World War I. World War I produces quite a rise, in any case, in union membership, and that's kind of has a feed-through effect on the level of militancy of various unions, particularly the coal industry, less so elsewhere, in the post-war period. And despite some reductions in the early 1920s, real wages remained actually rather high in comparison to Britain's main competitors. Well, that's more to do with Britain's main competitors being more impoverished at the end of the First World War. But nonetheless, they're approximately 80% higher than in Germany, for example. And those wages made up something like 85% of mining costs to each individual colliery. That's important when we get to the gold standard, because the gold standard kind of forces different businesses to try to reduce costs, and the most obvious cost to try to reduce for the collieries is wages, but that causes major political problems. And the gold standard, the reintroduction of the gold standard, hits the coal industry harder than any other industry. In fact, it's the major cause of the 1926 general strike. So let me just explain this a little more simply, I hope, anyway. So once you've pegged one's currency to a set amount of gold, So in the case of Britain, an ounce of gold in 1925, once the gold standard is restored, is roughly £4. But that means that unless there's an increase in the supply of gold, which is not likely to be, because there's probably only been maybe one or two occasions of that in living memory, the currencies couldn't be devalued. In other words, there's a set amount of currency buys a set amount of gold, and currency is freely convertible to gold. If you had £4, you could go and get an ounce of gold. That's what the gold standard actually means. Now, if you're a buyer, an overseas buyer of British coal, say you're a Belgian steelworks, then you might want to buy British coal for your furnaces. But in order to buy the coal, you first have to buy the pounds in order to do it. That's why the gold standard is problematic. So buying the pounds is expensive, especially after 1925, because sterling is chained to the gold standard. And so those overseas potential buyers are more likely to go elsewhere to a country where the currency is not tied to the gold standard, and so is effectively cheaper because it's floating. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense. So that sucks demand away from the British coal industry even more than the demand that's already been removed by the previous sort of 30 or 40 years, and particularly the First World War. The only way to compete for British coal manufacturers, British coal producers, is to try and make their export prices cheaper by reducing their costs. And the only way to reduce their costs, really, their substantial costs, is by squeezing wages. And that's why there is an enormous conflagration, which ends up in the 1926 general strike, because miners are quite understandably unwilling to take a pay cut. Now, it's possible to see the logic of maybe British industry competing less on price and more on the basis of superior quality finished products or even capital goods. And in those cases, the price hike brought about by the gold standard will be less severe, but it's going to be severe in primary industries, extractive industries. Primary industries, incidentally, in case you're unaware, that's anything that is where there's no extra human input in order to transform a basic product, a raw material, into something else. So that will be principally agriculture, mining of various things, coal principally, but also things like tin, iron ore, and so forth, and also things like forestry. So that's the primary sector, generally speaking, and the primary sector is going to be particularly hard hit because there's no way of improving quality. Coal is coal; it's a mineral, not likely to be superior in any way if it's dug up from under the soil of Britain than if it had been dug up from under the soil of Poland. And so the domestic market for coal was also particularly susceptible to foreign dumping because for that exactly the same reason. Primary goods, the quality is that there's not much variability in quality. If coal is expensive in the UK as well as when it's being sold, then it's very easy for manufacturers elsewhere to undercut and dump their goods potentially on the British market. And final thing that I'm going to point out there is the unemployment rates there. I mentioned, I gave you a few figures for unemployment rates in the late 1920s earlier on, and here you can see that the unemployment rates in this period for the total labour force is about 10%, just over 10%. But in coal mining, that's 16.5%, and in Wales, it's 19.3%. Well, the reason I give you Wales is because, of course, there's an enormous coal mining industry in South Wales. Okay. So, in summary, even before the Wall Street crash, Britain has a major unemployment problem. It has major public debt, which it seeks to solve, or it's forced to try and solve through the imposition of the gold standard, and at least one critical industry, the coal industry, essentially on life support. And so when we come to the 1929 general election, it's unemployment is kind of front and center in the Labour Party campaign. And as I keep saying, this is before the crash. This is before the Wall Street crash, a good 5 or 6 months before the Wall Street crash, the 29 general election. And it's one of the reasons why Ramsay MacDonald's Labour Party is able to get power, is actually becomes the largest single party in the House of Commons. Doesn't get a majority. But it plays very heavily, as you can see. There's a kind of excerpts from its campaign. It plays very heavily on this persistent unemployment problem, and in particular the specific difficulties that are attached to the coal industry. So I'm sort of got a cheery yellow poster there on the left-hand side. Men and women workers, your chance at last. Vote Labour to your own interests. In the centre, we have that's an excerpt from the Labour Party 1929 general election manifesto, which, if you ever want to see a piece of startling political naivety in terms of setting up hostages for fortune, then do read the 1929 Labour Party general election manifesto, because it's quite ambitious, to say the least, and really kind of startlingly naive. But the Labour Party there makes unemployment kind of the centre of its programme, an unqualified pledge to deal immediately and practically with this question. Now, what actually happened once the Labour Party ascends to power is that all this radicalism, which is bound up in that manifesto and in that campaign, is whittled away. I wouldn't say it vanishes overnight, but it goes quite quickly, and certainly it's even before the Wall Street crash, the government is becoming more and more timid. What is very clear, that on its own terms, it did fail, and fail quite badly, because it ironically presides over an increase of unemployment of almost 1.5 million workers. But by saying that it failed, and by saying it is not, I should stress, to suggest that either of the other two major political parties would have done any better. There's simply no strong evidence for that at all. But nonetheless, it clearly, the Labour Party, and its first flush of power, in a sense, runs into enormous difficulties. So the magnitude of the stock market crash, severe though it is not enough to explain why the Labour Party fails. So instead, there are a whole series of other things that are kind of going on here. First of all, it's a minority government, as I've already said, so it's dependent on the goodwill of either the Liberal or the Conservative parties. Now, actually, for most of the time, those parties behave reasonably well towards the new government. They don't deliberately try to sabotage it. There's a kind of a certain courteousness, or courtesy rather, that is observed between the different parties. But though, of course, they do have their red lines, and those are both parties are kind of wedded to the gold standard, wedded to that economic orthodoxy. The Liberal Party is absolutely obsessed with free trade, so the Labour Party would find it very difficult, even though the Conservatives would perhaps be interested in that. Labour Party would find it very difficult to take a protectionist route, erecting tariffs and so forth. And the Conservatives are, insofar as they think about these things at all, concerned about not diminishing private ownership and trying to deflate the public debt. So those are the kind of the red lines of the opposition parties in this period, and it's very difficult for a minority government to ram a program through when there are those potential sources of opposition. And the Labour Party also gets kind of bewitched and captured by this Treasury view, this economic orthodoxy about the gold standard, about free trade, about paying back the public debt. The Treasury view is actually kind of expands and now encompasses an idea that major public deficit spending will actually crowd out an equivalent volume of potential private investment. Actually, that doesn't really make a great deal of sense, and didn't even at the time. But nonetheless, that's kind of become the conventional wisdom, and the Labour Party sucks that up. Particularly Snowden, this chap here, Philip Snowden, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He is rigidly orthodox in his approach to the public finances, and so sets his face against all sorts of things that the Labour Party has promised in its 1929 manifesto, such as an increase in public works and nationalisation and things like that. I've already mentioned how the kind of political naivety that went alongside this government, the assumption that somehow just that its British programme will be easy to bring about. And there was certainly a bureaucratic inertia, not least from the Treasury, but also from all other civil service departments, simply because it takes an awfully long time for a piece of legislation, particularly something complicated like nationalisation, to be framed and to be put together and then to pass through the Houses of Parliament. Curiously, there's a great fear of statism and command economy. Those memories of the Bolshevik Revolution are still very strong, and it's, with hindsight, you can say that those fears are probably overblown, but nonetheless, as soon as you get things like state direction of labour, as of course you do have in the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent in fascist Italy. I haven't mentioned Nazi Germany there, of course, because Nazi Germany doesn't exist at this point. Then you do start to impinge on the individual freedom and so forth, and that is peculiarly worrying for the Liberals and for the Conservatives, and even for a large part of the Labour Party itself as well. And there are a lot of intra-party clashes. On the left-hand side of the screen there, you've got a picture of Oswald Mosley carrying off part of the Labour Party into the woods as a sort of a knight errant. Mosley put forward of course, later famously the leader of the British Union of Fascists, but at this point, Labour cabinet minister. And he produces a program which contains the erection of protection, the tariff barriers, also a major a program of public works, and shifting Britain's currency off the gold standard. This is, but it goes down like an absolute lead balloon within the Labour Party, let alone outside of the Labour Party. It's one of the reasons why Mosley resigns, leaves the Labour Party ultimately, and goes on to create his little band of black shirts. And then at the end of the day, it is the scale of the existing problems and their exacerbation by the collapse in world demand. And this is one of the reasons why Labour Party, by 1931, by the middle of 1931, is really in a bind and ultimately collapses and gives way to the national government that follows, which is ostensibly a kind of a coalition of the leaderships of the three main parties there. I was going to talk very quickly about the recovery, but with one eye on the time, I'm going to really make this incredibly brief. What this does is, what the table and the graph here do show is that is what I've been saying pretty much throughout the lecture, that the slump itself, the depression itself, hits Britain less severely than it does most other countries. You can see that here in the manufacturing production percentage change between 1929 and 33. So Britain takes a hit there of almost 11%, but it's completely nothing like as bad as it is in Italy, Germany, even France and Belgium, and the United States, for that matter. But that's because, of course, it's already in the doldrums. The British economy is already in the doldrums for the whole period, practically the whole period from 1920 through to the onset of the Depression at the beginning of the 1930s, and that shows how far behind the British economy is. If the French manufacturing production is growing at 42%, and the Belgian at about 40%. Italy and the Netherlands, likewise, massive increases in manufacturing production in that period between 1913 and 1929. But Britain, that's really quite paltry, 22% increase in manufacturing production. On the other hand, it recovers relatively quickly as well. You can see that in terms of world gross domestic product, and this is the aggregate, that bottoms out in 1932. But in Britain, it actually bottoms out there in 1931. And it recovers to its 1929 level about there. So in late 1933, whereas world GDP doesn't recover until there, all the way over there in 1936. So, but the problem with that, of course, is that recovery to 1929 levels is rubbish, because in 1929 Britain is already in this parlor state. So it doesn't actually really start to recover back to the levels of the early 1920s or the the period immediately either before or after the First World War until back here, or until 1937. And that's why that's this sense that Britain is sort of in depression, certainly in recession for most of the 1920s. Okay, a very quick summary, I promise, and then I'll let you go. Or you can ask me questions, of course. So Britain's economic problems predate the slump by a long way, as I think we've already seen. And there are kind of systemic weaknesses or biases in the economy, at least, and those are exposed and worsened by World War One. The tendency towards trade being a major component of GDP, lack of protection for industry, and so on and so forth. Parts of Britain, as I've already said, were in recession throughout the 1920s. So when the slump comes, it does, although it's bad, it doesn't really cause the enormous collapse that you see comparatively in other countries. So the Wall Street crash and all the myth that swirls around that doesn't apply to quite the same extent in Britain as it does in most of continental Europe. We've seen that the staple industries, especially coal, were particularly badly affected by the First World War. And I've already said that the Depression, although it had this effect on Britain, it was considerably less severe because of those existing problems. Those existing problems were not solved by the economic orthodoxies of the day. In fact, those economic orthodoxies, the gold standard, the kind of stubborn refusal to go for protection and instead to adhere to free trade, the determination to reduce public debt at all costs, and the refusal to countenance deficit financing and public works. All of those played their part in slowing down the British economy and making it more difficult for it to recover. I castigated the 29-31 Labour government for its poor performance, and it was poor, but it is rather difficult, given all the restrictions on its freedom of movement, to see anyone else doing better in the circumstances. And the Depression only really begins to lift after those old conventional policies, those old financial orthodoxies begin to be discarded, curiously enough. So that's what I wanted to show you. The core here is the Depression in Britain is not really simply a phenomenon of the 1930s. In fact, Britain has a rather different way in which it experiences that depression, and that's largely because of its economic history over the previous 40, 50 years. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Sorry that we went on a little bit longer than I expected, but I'll now turn off the recording and you are at liberty to ask